Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Castro here. We're going to take a look at Chapter 18. There's a lot in terms of Chapter 18. Really, with Chapter 18, and a lot of what we've been talking about this whole era prior to the Civil War is called the antebellum, or prior to the war period, as antebellum means. So we're going to take a look at some of the stuff that's in there. Again, looking at roughly the period between 1848 and 1854, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in there. So let's take a look. So one of the things that comes up for discussion immediately following the Mexican session with the Mexican-American War is, what are we going to do with this land? Are we going to allow the people? Are these territories that eventually form California, Nevada, parts of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico? Are we going to allow them to become slave states or not? Right? Because again, one of the big pushes right west, especially in the Southwest, is to further the institution of slavery. And so one of the big questions will be with that. So the debate over slavery, right, in the new territory, one of the things that kind of pushes that debate is David Wilmot, congressman. He, with the Mexican session, so one of the things that he said was that, and he wanted to add a what becomes known as the Wilmot Proviso to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which would have basically denied slavery in the territory that was accessed from that was gained from Mexico, and so that kind of rages the Southerners, right? It doesn't get added to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but it makes the Southerners realize that this is going to become again a pressing issue. So one of the things that's brought up is this guy right here. So um, this guy, so General Louis Cass, he actually was an advocate of something called popular sovereignty. And so Southern Democrats began pushing for popular sovereignty. And what it was this idea that, you know what, the federal government should not be deciding on which states are free and which ones are slave states. And so his argument is that the people, once they become, once the territory becomes a state, it should be up to the people of the state whether or not they are free or slave states. And so one of the things that I want to ask you guys in class, and to be part of your questions, is what are the consequences, right? So why would Northerners want popular sovereignty? Why would Southerners want popular sovereignty, right? And why wouldn't they? And why wouldn't they, right? So it's something to think about in terms of how does it benefit either both North or South. So the doctrine was popular because it was consistent with the idea of democracy, though, right? Again, letting the people choose. And again, we'll talk about that. So the Whigs nominated General Zachary Taylor. He had never even voted for president. The Whigs avoided position on slavery issue. Okay, even though again Taylor was a slave owner. The Northern abolitionists organized a new party called the Free Soil Party. So this is going to become really important because it's not just an abolitionist party. But it's also people who wanted free soil, like soil in the north and west, to be free of slavery. Because if you think about it, even if you're not an abolitionist from the standpoint of moral reasons, the fact that you could have free people working was in direct competition to poor whites. So when we look at this, right, the Free Soil Party was for the Wilmot Proviso. Federal aid for internal improvements, free homesteads for people. It did attract some Democrats that were afraid of Southern dominance of the party, some conscious Whigs, some racial purists. They did not want to share territories with blacks. So again, the Free Soil Party is kind of everybody who's not a Southern Democrat wanting to push for slavery. So the Free Soils, they nominated Martin Van Buren, which was, again, I mean, why would you do that? Opposed slavery because limited opportunities for white wage earners for upward mobility. So the Free Soilers were able to divert some of the votes from Cass in New York, and so Taylor ends up getting elected. So Zachary Taylor becomes the president. So one of the things that's really interesting, so for the election of 1848, right? So one of the things that's also interesting, right? In the same month that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, right? Gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. By 1849, right, to respond to lawlessness of gold miners encouraged by Zachary Taylor, California citizens drafted a constitution with no slavery. So they applied for statehood, and so it's going to become very controversial because California would upset the balance. So 1850, the South boasted, one of the things to think about is the president was from the South, Zachary Taylor. The Supreme Court, okay, the Supreme Court of the United States was made up mostly of Southerners. They controlled the veto power in the Senate, in terms of not allowing something to happen, right? Because they didn't control the House. Cotton prices were high. They were doing well. There were few who thought Southern slavery would threaten. Yet the South is going to be upset about a few things. Number one, the balance of 15 free slaves and free states, right? So 15 and 15 would be undone by California. So by the time California applies for statehood in 1849, there were 30 total states. So California would be number 31 as a free state. It would upset the balance, maybe forever, because New Mexico and Utah were also thinking about applying, and they wanted to be free. Texas wanted large disputed area that the federal government wanted to separate, threatened to use of force, a couple of things that they were dealing with. There were also efforts for free DC between slave states. So there was some conversation that Congress wanted to make Washington DC free of slaves. And one of the other things that was upsetting them was, of course, the Underground Railroad. So again, Underground Railroad, informal chain of stations which had traveling runaway slaves. But the Moses, right, of the black people, right, is Harriet Tubman, and so she was the conductor. She was able to rescue more than 300 slaves. Interestingly enough, right, in the same month that she died, Rosa Parks was actually born. So result was the South wanted a stricter fugitive slave law. So the argument was, if we're going to allow California in, we want a stricter fugitive slave law. And so they were losing approximately $5 to $10 million worth of slaves a year. So in 1850, California's admission becomes very controversial. So you begin to see what are called Southern fire eaters talking of secession if California came in. The crises brought Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts to debate over all these things for the last time. And so Henry Clay, at age 73, was able to engineer his third and final compromise. So Clay urged compromise on both sides, the North to accept new fugitive slave law. Calhoun, 68, said the South, he advocated that slavery should be left alone, return all runaways. Calhoun died during the debate because he was really sick. Webster from Massachusetts supported Clay's compromise. He gave this speech, and it's called the 7th of March speech, in which he said, "Look, let's not even mess with this, right? Let's not worry about expanding slavery into the Southwest, because there's no way that they'll be able to farm there, and therefore, like, slavery won't be able to exist." So 7th of March speech increased Union sentiment in North, police, banking, and commercial centers. Abolitionists, though, felt betrayed because he was basically saying, don't worry about it, instead of trying really hard to ban it. Now, the debate was not over. There was, again, a lot of the conscious Whigs. One of the conscious Whigs is a guy by the name of William Seward, and William Seward gave a rousing speech against slavery, and he said that God's moral law was higher law than the Constitution. This is going to be really important. The reason it's important is because in 1850, Zachary Taylor, one of the things that ends up happening is that Zachary Taylor, he was so moved by the speech that he decided that he was not going to sign the Compromise of 1850, but he gets really sick and he dies. So Zachary Taylor actually dies. It's believed by having a concoction of like spoiled milk and spoiled cherries, and so essentially like a bacteria and like the intestines in the stomach, and so he ends up dying. So the guy who takes over is Millard Fillmore from New York. He gladly signed the Compromise of 1850, and so the Southern Fire Eaters attempted to boycott Northern goods, but sentiment died. And so one of the things that we'll see with the Compromise of 1850 is a really small sort of second era of good feelings. So the Compromise of 1850, right, what we see is the North gets California a free state, disputed territory in New Mexico, that was from Texas. That's why Texas has that like chunk, okay, on the left side. No slave trade in D.C. So the South would get popular sovereignty in New Mexico and Utah. And Texas would get $10 million for that land loss and a stricter fugitive slave law. So in terms of balancing what's going to happen, so you can see California there becomes a 31st state. The Utah territory, the New Mexico territory. Clearly the North got the better of the deal. Although the Southerners, they had something in their back pocket. And basically what they were thinking was that eventually they would try to get Cuba in what becomes known as the Austin Manifesto of 1854, but that's actually going to backfire. So, fugitive slave law was fervently opposed in the North. Slaves could not testify, denied jury trial. Federal commissioners were paid more if slaves were returned. Those who aided slaves might be fined or forced to join slave catchers. Many Northern moderates became abolitionists. Many mobs rescued slaves from captors. Massachusetts made a criminal offense for any state official to enforce the law, and again, so other states enacted personal liberty laws, which again, if you can make the argument, was many Northern moderates became abolitionists. Mobs rescue again. Massachusetts made a criminal offense, like I said. Southerners were upset because the North would not follow through on their side of a compromise. There was a 10-year delay for war by compromise led to, so it actually allowed the North to kind of prepare for what's eventually going to come. 1852, the Democrats nominated second dark horse Franklin Pierce. He was kind of weak, indecisive, but a pro-slavery Northerner, acceptable to slavery wing of the party. Platform was it supported the Compromise of 1850. The Whigs turned to another military hero, Winfield Scott. He not a very popular man. The Whig platform supported compromise, but less enthusiastically than the Democrats, right, because of the contest. The Whigs party was split. Anti-slavery Whigs accepted Scott, but hated the platform endorsement of the fugitive slave law. So the Southern Whigs accepted platform, but hated Scott. The result is that Franklin Pierce wins the election of 1850. The election marked effective end of the Whig Party, began the end of national parties. The Whig legacy was that leaders who preserved the Union like Clay, Webster, both of whom died during the 1852 campaign. So, cabinet of Pierce contained aggressive Southerners. Secretary of War was Jefferson Davis, who wanted to acquire more slave territory. Right, he eventually becomes the president of the Confederacy. Expansionism also inspired by California gold discovery. So, the Mexican War, again, looking towards Central America and Cuba. So we begin to see the slavocracy, right, of the slavecrats realized the door was closed on territory, so they began looking south. For example, Nicaragua, there was a U.S. adventurer by the name of William Walker, took over Nicaragua in 1856, legalized slavery, but Central American nations defeated and they actually executed him. Britain also began interested in Nicaragua for canal route, which would violate the Monroe Doctrine agreement between us and the European countries. And again, we'll come back to the Monroe Doctrine. It doesn't end up happening. So like I said, Cuba was regarded as the most attractive slave territory available, could carve into several states, right? Polk had tried to buy it, but Spain refused. So seizure was the only option, and similar to what we had done with Mexico. Secretary of State ordered U.S. ministers in Spain, England, and France to make recommendations to acquire Cuba. The three met at Austin, Belgium, and they drew up a secret plan to be able. The plan suggested the U.S. offer Spain $120 million. If it refused, it would use force to get it. The Austin Manifesto was leaked and angered many northern free soilers, so Pierce forced to drop the scheme for acquiring Cuba, so it doesn't happen. But again, the numbers are still 31 to 30. So travel to Oregon, California was very difficult by land or sea. Realistic transportation vital to keeping new territories in the Union. So a possible solution was to build a transcontinental railroad. Both the North and South wanted the route to begin in their section. The South knew best southern route went just beyond the Mexican border, but they needed to acquire the area. You can see this yellow area here. Jefferson Davis arranged for James Gadsden, a railroad promoter, to be minister to Mexico in 1853. Gadsden and Santa Anna agreed on a $10 million deal to purchase this yellow area here that becomes known as the could build the railroad. The purchase would allow the route with fewest mountains, more safety because only traveling through organized areas. The Southerners in Congress prevented organizing of Nebraska territory to deter the Northern Railroad. So they said, we're not going to develop Nebraska yet because they wanted the railroad to be built. But the senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, responded to the Gadsden purchase by scheming to get Western Railroad's a terminal in Chicago. And so he also had connections with the railroads, and the people that he knew wanted the railroad to be built in the north. He tried to get the Southerners' support for the plan by replacing the Missouri Compromise of 1820 with the idea of popular sovereignty. We'll address this a little bit. So both Kansas and Nebraska were barred from slavery by the Missouri Compromise because they were above the 36th parallel. Kansas would likely be a slave and Nebraska free, but again, they were being barred from doing that. And so he's saying, look, if we build the railroads in the north instead of the south, I will convince Congress of a compromise, of some sort of a compromise, where that part of the Missouri Compromise is struck down and Kansas and Nebraska can decide for themselves. So the Free Soilers in Congress viewed the Missouri Compromise as sacred, but Douglas pushed the bill through. So popular sovereignty supporters in West approved, but Douglas underestimated anger and resolve of many Northerners. In the end, the Kansas-Nebraska Act will pass, and we'll talk about that a little bit more with Chapter 19. And as a result of that, we're going to see some crazy battles take place in Kansas, but that's for the next chapter.